In my previous video, I discussed adding images to BugGuide. Now I'm going to talk about managing the images you've added to BugGuide. I'll discuss how you can find your images, how you can move your images, and when you should move your images, how you can request identifications if you're waiting for a while and haven't gotten one, and when it's appropriate to request them, which is often. And also editing images long after you've submitted them. When should you edit them? Why should you edit them? And finally, I'll discuss commenting, replying to people's comments on your images, and what to do if you aren't getting a response to a reply to a comment on your image. Let's begin by talking about how to find images. In my last video, I added 4 images. This is the last one I added. Now, if I want to find my images, the simplest and least useful way of doing this is to click Your Images in the top right. Now I can see all my most recently added images. This is useful if you just added an image, navigated away from it in the guide, and want to get back to it. Here's another recently added image. But if you want to find a specific image that you added, say, 2 years ago, good luck finding it this way. If you've added lots of images, you're never going to find it that way. I have 13,128 images on BugGuide, which means if I'm looking for an image this way, I'm out of luck. So, how do I find a specific image? Let's say I was looking for this image. How do I find it? Well, if I'm looking for my images of this species, I can find them this way. There is another way of finding them. Let's say you're starting here. Use that clickable guide, click the moth icon. There are other icons, although not all groups have icons here. And the fastest way to navigate through the guide is with the taxonomy, because it's faster to load than browse, which shows randomly selected images which take a while to select. So I'm going to use the taxonomy tab. Now, if I know the taxonomy for the species well, I can find it pretty quickly. But certainly if I don't know the taxonomy, it's not a very efficient way of doing it. And at any rate, just searching is faster. But either way, whether you search it or go through the taxonomy, you get to the species page. Now the info tab has information on the species. The images tab shows images, including some of my images, like these. So I could find my images by looking through here, but if it's a common species with 25 pages of images, it could take a while to find them. So now I'm going to go to the data tab here. This shows the states and provinces with images of this species on BugGuide. And practically all my observations are from Rhode Island. So I'm going to look for my images from Rhode Island. And I'm the biggest contributor of moth images and images of all arthropods from Rhode Island. So a majority of the images here are usually going to be mine. But if I want to find my images specifically, I'm going to type in this number. And now I'm seeing my images. This is all my images on BugGuide of this species. Now, how do I know what number to put in there? Well, if I go to my account page here, and go to the URL, and all this shows is bugguide.net/user/view, which is not helpful. But if I sign out, I'm going to log out, And now I'm going to find my page. So you can search your name and find it that way. And now since I'm logged out, it won't show my user page, it'll just show Aaron Hunt's user page. And this is the number at the end of the URL. If I copy that, that's what I need to do. That's the number I need to use to find my images. Now I'm going to log back in. And again, this number doesn't show up now. But let's say I want to find my images. Let's go back. Let's say I want to find my images of all Spodoptera. And let's say I'm not me and I'm someone else, and I'm someone who adds images from lots of places. Well, again, you can use the search function, except you have to leave the location field blank. The quickest way of doing this is as follows. Click on one of the months, and select all of the months. Put in my number. And now there's no state or province selected. So if I had images from anywhere other than Block Island, which I don't, they'd show up here. I can use this, for example, with don't have many images not from Rhode Island. There we go. This image is from Massachusetts, and now it shows up since I don't have a state selected. Now, I got there so quickly by typing in the genus name here. If I type in this name, a few options show up. Let's say I want to find the image I added last video of Epiblema scuderiana. Type in Epiblema, I have all the Epiblema species that show up. Keep typing. There's scuderiana, and that's the number for Epiblema scuderiana. And the reason that's the number is if I go to the info tab, or any of these tabs really, if I go to the species page, look at the URL, 29508, that's the number that shows up there. And now I have all my images of that species. Well, let's say I want something more general. Maybe I want all my images of noctuids. Start typing in the name. That shows up. Now I have lots and lots of images, and I can look through all my images of noctuids. But there are other uses of advanced search. Let's say most of my images of moths are identified, but some of them aren't. How do I find my unidentified images? Well, let's say I want to find my unidentified images of all moths. 57 is the number for Lepidoptera. I know that because I've had to type it in lots of times, but if I didn't know that, start typing in Lepidoptera, and there it is. Now I'm going to exclude images at species level. So this means most of these images are not going to show up. This image, for instance, is identified to species. You can see the glide placement here. So now when I search, that's not going to show up. Instead, I get everything that's not been identified to species. Now some of these are sort of identified to species. This one is effectively identified to species, but the species page, if we go to taxonomy, is a no taxon page because this is undescribed. This one, for instance, is identified to genus, so it shows up. This one, too, is identified to genus, so it shows up here. I have 499 Lepidoptera images not identified to species. Most of these, of course, from Block Island, but not all are. And if I want to find just the Rhode Island ones, select Rhode Island. And now we're down to 490. You can also add the location. And still 490 because they're all from Block Island. I can also add a phrase in the description. I tend to leave descriptions blank, so there's not a lot to search here. But if you have a term you can search, I'm not actually sure if this will show up. Let's see. No, okay. So all you can do there is what's in the remarks section, which again, I basically always leave blank. But for instance, if we want to find this user's images with this phrase, identified on iNaturalist, we can do his number instead. We can also clear form to get rid of everything. Now nothing's selected. I'm going to add in the user ID. We'll do just Lepidoptera. Add the phrase in description, identified on iNaturalist. And now you get these images. Identified on iNaturalist. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, you can also use the identifier field to organize your images. Just about the only thing I put in the identifier field is an identifier that denotes the black lighting night I found it on. So if when I'm on Block Island, I search for moths every night at the porch lights, and so I don't add identifiers there. But if I go out with sheets and black lights to some other location on the island, I create a search term for that night, and then everything from that night can show up there. There are other things to do with that. So if I do, I think this is it. These are all my images of moths on goldenrod. Can also do something else. Don't remember what I did for that search term, but anyway, this will turn up any of the images that have that search term. It'll also turn up other images, so you want to make sure if you use a search term in the identifier field, it's something unique that no one else is going to use. Because if someone else uses it, their images will show up too. Now someone who makes quite extensive use of that field is Robert Lord Zimlick. I'm going to find his page. And here we have his search term for the species he's the only one to have added on Block Island. On BugGuide. So now these are, at least when he added the search term for these images, these are species no one else has contributed to BugGuide. So if I go to this one, all these images are his. He also has new taxa for Alabama, and this is anything he photographed and added to BugGuide that was the first image of its species for the state of Alabama. and he has quite a few of those. You can use the identifier field however you want. I don't use it very much. Some people use it a bit more. But remember that it has to be something unique. So for instance, with this, he has Zimlik AL1, which presumably no one else is going to use. But if you add something really generic there, other people are going to use it, and it's not going to be very useful. So now I'm going to talk about moving images. Let's say I'll show what I do as an editor. This one here has been identified. I asked Michael Savarin to comment on this since he's an expert on the group, and he can provide more reliable identifications of these than I can. And he says this is Pelocrista hazellana. Now, Jim Eckert could move this, but he probably hasn't seen that comment yet, so I'm going to be willing to move it. So it's been identified as that species. I'm going to click Tag All, and all the images of this individual are tagged. They appear here. Search the name of the species. And there are very few results because there are actually no images placed to the species yet. And here's the species page. Go to the Images tab. There are no images. I'll move these images. Click Move Tagged Images, and it sometimes takes a bit. Shouldn't take this long. There we go. Now the images are here. There are a few reasons to do this. The selfish reason is that now that the images have been moved, Jim Eckert can easily find his images of this species using advanced search as I showed earlier. Of course, in this case, he doesn't really need to use advanced search because the only images are his, but this is certainly useful for common species, and even if it's something uncommon, if it's been identified, but you don't have the identified name anywhere in any of the fields for the image, if you search that term, your image is not going to show up. This one has this as a suggested ID, which ended up being wrong. This comment actually shows up, so you can still find it, but your images won't show up. And let's say Jim had actually managed to identify this himself. He added the image, no one identified it, and he eventually figured it out. And let's say he's confident of the identification, confident enough to place it into the guide. Now, if he doesn't do anything to his image, if he searches that name, nothing's going to show up. So the selfish reason to move your image is that now the image is where it belongs, and you can easily use advanced search to find it. If you don't do that, and all your images are, let's say, stuck in Lepidoptera, they tend to be pretty hard to find. There are ways of finding them using advanced search, but it's not that easy. Of course, there are other reasons for this. One of them is that it's actually a little bit faster if an editor sees an image and knows what it is. It's faster to just comment the name of the image than to move the images. It doesn't take that long to move the images, but it takes a little bit longer, and I identify thousands of images a year, so I prefer to comment if I know what it is. Especially when I'm on my phone. It's much faster on my phone than moving the images. So I prefer to be able to comment. Let's say I could comment the name of the species, then post that comment. And now if the person who submitted the image, if Jim moves these images, now my job's done. But there are quite a few users of BugGuide who have not noticed that they can move their own images or haven't figured it out. And sometimes what ends up happening is I'll comment with an ID, and then nothing will happen for months and months, and then eventually I have to move the image myself. So if you move your own images, editors will appreciate it. Now there are other reasons to move your image other than that it was identified. Let's say you add an image to ID request, and it sits there and sits there and sits there, and nothing happens to it. And let's say it gets pretty far back in ID request. Now at this point, if it's way back here, it's probably not getting identified. At least it's not getting identified straight from ID request. I pretty much never check ID request past about the 10th page. So if you add a moth to ID request and it doesn't, and you don't move it in the guide before it gets there, I'm probably not going to see it, which means someone else is going to have to move it into the guide and probably won't identify it to species, which means the identification will probably take longer. So it's in your interest to move your own images to make sure that they don't go way to the back of ID request. Now, how do you move images? I'm actually going to move this image. It's not mine, but as an editor, I can move anyone's images. As a regular contributor, you can move only your own images, but the process is exactly the same. So I'm going to tag the image. Now you can see I identified this one. So I'm going to navigate to the proper place in the guide. Going to make sure I'm on the right page. Go to images, and actually I'm going to pause here to select male. Since I commented it's male, so we now know it's male. And then move tagged images, and there it is. And now, if we use advanced search to search for this user's images, just pick a random state, clear the form. There's the species. And there's the image. There's at least one major reason to move images, and that's that sometimes you place an image at species and then you become uncertain about the identification. So let's say Ken added this image, then took a second look and thought, you know what, I'm actually not sure. Or maybe I thought this was this species, but it's actually pretty clearly this other species. This identification happens to be correct, but let's say he looks at this and says, I don't know about this one actually. Tag your image, and you probably don't want to move it to Renia. As I mentioned in the last video, it's generally not advisable to post something to genus. Maybe you could post it to subfamily. There aren't a lot of images there. It might not be a great idea. We could just move it back here. Might take a while to get identified, but it will eventually get identified. Again, that wasn't misidentified, so I'm not actually going to move it. And again, it's important to manage your own images as you learn more about identification, as you reconsider old identifications. It's important to manage them because if you add a misidentified image, it can sometimes take several years for someone to notice that it's wrong and fix it. But if you realize that your ideas about identification of something were wrong in the past and you need to change them, which happens with everyone, you want to move your own images to make sure that they're not misplaced in the guide. Not just so that you can find them where they belong, but also so that other people who look in the guide aren't misled by incorrectly placed images. Now let's say you've added an image and it's pretty far back. Let's say it's all the way over here. Page 101 of Lepidoptera. I'm actually currently working through the backlog that accumulated over the last year. I cleared out all unsorted Lepidoptera images last January, and now it's January 2022, and the backlog is built back up. I've been working through them, but it'll still take me a while. But let's say Marcia added this image May 13th, 2021, and it's been a while. It hasn't been identified. What can she do to get it identified? Well, one option is to tag the image and say, all right, it's way back on the 100th page. Who knows if it's getting seen anytime soon. I'm going to move it to where I know it belongs. So you can search where it belongs, or you can go through the taxonomy if you know. So maybe I'll move it to UCosme. There are lots of images here, but now if I move it here, maybe it'll appear on the 5th page rather than the 100th page. This way I might get seen a bit sooner. You don't have to do that, but it's an option. Now let's say you add an image, or let's say you add an image and maybe you know the genus, but you don't know the species, and it looks like it's awfully hard to determine species. And there are a lot of images of unidentified species at that genus. A lot of unidentified images stuck at that genus. And I think this could take a long time to get identified. It'll probably eventually end up at genus and just sit there, potentially for years. What can I do to get it identified faster? Well, one thing you can do, there's no way within BugGuide to message someone. You could comment on your own image, I suppose, but if no one's identifying your image without the comment, probably no one's identifying it with the comment. Although, let's say Gregory initially just uploaded this image as moth, and then later thought, now I'm not actually familiar with the species, but later he thought, this might be right. And yeah, looks like it could be right. So in this case, he's just edited his image, I assume. This was added May 7th, 2021. You can see here, it says it was last updated May 31st, 2021. So it looks like what happened is a few weeks after he added the image, he thought he came up with the correct ID. But he's not sure, so he just left it here. This is actually not a bad example, because there's only one image of this species. So that could mean a few things without knowing anything else about this group. If this is all you know, there's just one image. That could mean it's a rare species, or maybe the whole genus is rare. Or it could mean it's just very difficult to identify, and maybe the one image here shouldn't have even been placed here because it's actually impossible to identify just from images. Or maybe it was dissected, or maybe it was identified by an expert. Now if we go to the genus, wow, not a lot of images of this genus. So this is clearly a pretty uncommon genus. And amazingly enough, there are 4 images of 3 species. So anything you find in this genus is going to be uncommon. Now let's say Gregory really wants this identified. Maybe he's trying to finish his list of species found in Kane County, Utah. Or maybe he's just interested in it. Or maybe, and I would appreciate this, maybe he looks at the MPG page and sees that there are no images here, and thinks this would be great to add to MPG. Now MPG is the Moth Photographers group, and this is a great way to identify moths. There are images of lots of species here that are not on BugGuide. They have plates of images. With a lot of the micro moths, they're missing species, but a lot of species are included here. And quite a few of these are species that actually have never been photographed live, or at least have never been identified from live photographs. So anyway, let's say he sees this is something interesting. One thing he could do, since he's added a lot of moth images, I know that he knows that I'm the main identifier of images of moths on BugGuide. So maybe he thinks, I'm going to email Aaron and see if he's interested in this and see if he can identify it. He can go to my account page. Now, of course, he wouldn't click your account, he would find my account page. And he can see, actually this doesn't appear to other people, this part's private, or this is, but you can see I've put this here. A lot of people put inserts in their email addresses to prevent spam. I don't know if it's prevented any spam, but it seems like a decent thing to do. But he can email me, blockislander1@gmail.com. And he could email me and say, this one hasn't been identified, this looks interesting. And it's also not an image that has any live, it's also not a species that has any live images at MPG, which is really the resource for identifying moths with the most certainty. So you could email me and say, if this is a species, I don't know if this is something if this is a taxon you're familiar with, but if you know this genus, or maybe you don't, you can learn it. Could you identify this? This is something interesting. So when do you want to email people for help with identifications? Well, you don't want to email people with help for all your identifications. You should try to do some yourself. The things you think you know for certain, you should do yourself. If you really have no idea what something is, but you figure it's something common, just leave it and someone will eventually identify it. But if you have something that you're pretty sure is interesting, either because, let's say you know moths reasonably well, and you photograph something and you just have no idea what it is. You think this could be something interesting. Or maybe you photograph it and you think you figure out what it is, but you'd really like to get it confirmed, and it's something rare. For special cases like those, you could, for example, email me, or let's say it's an image of a fly. Don't email me because I won't know. But if you've added a lot of images of flies, or of any taxon, you'll become familiar with who ends up identifying most of them. And with most taxon BugGuide, there are just probably 1 to 5 people who identify almost everything. So you can look at that person's user page and see, look, there's an email listed. So if you see something really interesting and it hasn't gotten any attention, and he's another editor, he identifies most of the flies here. If you see something that you really think is interesting and he hasn't seen it, you might want to email him. You could also try emailing an expert if you find, say, a paper revising a genus. You might want to email that expert. And with a little luck, the person might respond to you if you found something interesting. Another option would be to add it to iNaturalist as well. If you haven't gotten lucky yet on BugGuide, you might get lucky on iNaturalist. But it's a good idea to try to move your images along, get them identified. If you think something's interesting, then there's a decent chance that an editor on BugGuide or someone else who knows the group well will also think it's interesting and will be motivated to help you identify it. Now let's say your image, say this one. Let's say an editor moves it to species. You don't have to do this, but you may want to edit the title. So in this instance, the title we now know is inaccurate. The suggested identification as a guess was Hypsopygia binodulalis, but it's actually Onalis. So if you want to, you can edit and replace with the accurate title. There are a few reasons to do this. One is that it might just look nicer. You might prefer your images to have the correct title. I'm actually going to change this one. So now you'll see, as I mentioned in the last video, now the only thing in the title is the species name. Another reason to do this is that if I search the species name, I'll get images mostly of this species, but they won't all be of this species. Some will be of other species, like this one that was misidentified originally. And in some cases, although not most, there are a lot of images that show up that aren't the species you want to find, which can be a bit annoying for people searching for images. But that's kind of a minor benefit. And it can even be somewhat useful to have some images that aren't the correct species that show up in these searches. Because let's say you search this species and then you see, oh, this looks like it. Then you see, oh, it's actually a different species. That can be a quick way for you to realize that there are some similar species you might want to rule out before you think you know what you found. Let's say as a different example, you've uploaded an image and you've realized it's not really a great image. It could be lighter. I kind of want to lighten it. Now this image looks fine, but let's say I want to lighten it. Well, I can edit it and find the image on my computer, say. Edit it, and then just drag and drop, just the same as you would if you're adding a new image, then submit. And then you have the image edited. Now I'll actually do an example of this. I don't know what causes this, but sometimes when people upload their images, it's never happened to me, but it happens to people with some regularity. You notice this one looks kind of squashed. If you click on it, it now appears with a different orientation. I guess some editing programs just have a bug that makes it kind of appear the wrong. I don't know exactly what happens, but I'm actually going to fix this one. And I say fix because the thumbnail is squished. This is not what the moth actually looks like. And sometimes when the proportions of the sides are very different, they can be really comically squished. So I'm going to edit this one. And again, as an editor, I can edit anyone's images, although it's bad form to just edit images for no reason. But if this were my image, the process would be exactly the same. Now, if this weird problem happens to you, on my computer, if I just do this, if I edit it in any way, drag and drop, submit. Now I've changed it. Now if I go back here, it appears normally. So that's one reason you might want to identify your images. If you notice, you might want to edit your images if you notice a problem that you need to fix. You also might want to edit your images if, let's say, an editor identifies your image and says you forgot the date. Oops. Go ahead and go into edit, add the date. Obviously the date isn't forgotten here, but sometimes that happens. Or let's say, in the case of moths, let's say I've identified your image, and I say there aren't any images of this species at MPG. MPG tends to use square images. Now, all of the images I upload are square. I've gotten into the habit of it. Most people don't do that. It's not a big deal if you don't, but square images can be quite useful. For instance, here I have this guide to Platinota. And square images are much better to use because they all have the same width and they all have the same height. So it just looks a lot neater. And it's easier to align everything. But maybe you've added an image and it's cropped really poorly and the moth looks tiny. I'll pick on this image. Let's say an editor comments on your image and says, could you crop this closer? You want to crop your image, and again, just like before, edit, drag and drop, submit, and now it's fixed. Another important aspect of taking care of your own images is responding to comments on your images. Not just by editing your images if needed, of course, but also, let's say after I added this image, someone commented questioning my identification. Someone said, this doesn't look right to me, are you sure about this ID? Now in this case, I'm quite sure. So I could say, yes, I'm sure. But let's say I'm not really. Let's say someone suggests an alternate ID. If that person's an editor, if the person's an editor and corrects the identification and says, this is definitely not this species, it's some other species, I'm going to move it there. If your images have been reliably identified, whether it's a corrected ID, or let's say your image is way back at Lepidoptera, and someone commented with the correct identification. If it's an editor, as a rule, just assume the identification is correct. Editors, of course, make mistakes, but they make mistakes less often than other BugGuide users. So you should assume reliability if an editor comments, unless you have good reason to think otherwise, unless you look at the identification and think, this doesn't really look right to me. So if someone provides an identification and it's reliable, move your own image, tag it. Let's say it's not Olivasiana. Let's say it's Viridis. Tag it, move tagged images, and it'll show up there. But let's say someone just questions the ID, isn't sure about it. Check the ID, see what you think. And if you aren't sure, you might want to move it back, maybe to tribe, maybe to subfamily. Or of course you could, especially if it's something uncommon, you could email an editor and say, could you take a look at this? Someone's questioned this ID and now I'm not so sure. And of course, you can also comment on other people's images. You can question their IDs if you have reason to think they're wrong, or you could suggest IDs. What if you don't get a response? What if someone moves your image? What if I move your image of a moth, and you think the identification doesn't look right, and you respond to my comment moving the moth, saying, are you sure about this? Or something to that effect, preferably something polite. And let's say you wait a few days and I don't respond. Chances are if I'm going to respond, it's going to be within a day. So if I haven't responded in a few days, it's probably because I did not subscribe to that image. What does that mean? Well, this is the unsubscribe button here. You can subscribe or unsubscribe if you'd like. If you comment on an image, or as an editor, if you move an image, and moving an image leaves a comment on it, I believe you have the option of automatically subscribing to everything you move. Yes. So you can select that, and that means if I comment on an image, I'm automatically subscribed to it, which means I receive an email update if someone else comments on it. But I don't do that. And the simple reason is that I've commented on more than 60,000 images, and I just don't want to deal with all the emails I might receive. And in the vast majority of cases, I move an image, I'm confident in the placement, and I have no real reason to look at the image again. But sometimes I get it wrong. And if you think I've gotten it wrong on one of your images, or on someone else's image, and you comment on it and I don't reply, and the same goes for any other editor or anyone else, any other user, you can go to my user page and email me. And you should be proactive about it. You shouldn't leave questions. If you think something's misidentified, you don't want to leave it and then forget about it and then find 5 years later it's still misidentified. But if you leave a comment and no one responds, there's a good chance it's because the person you're addressing hasn't subscribed to the image and just has no idea that you've left the comment. That's about it for managing your images. This was a fairly long video, but I hope it was useful to a lot of people.